Hi everyone, my name is Oscar Baechler and I'm here to talk to you about how to sculpt like you are drawing. This is a talk about stuff I do in Blender. First off, a little bit about me. I'm often thought of as the user group guy. I've been running the Seattle Blender user group for 15 years now. In fact, this is a picture from the 2019 Blender conference where I gave a talk on our 10th anniversary about how to keep a user group going. You can see many Blender experts here in this first photo from way back, including Ian Hubert, Delay Valento, Mike Pan, Nathan Vegdahl, a lot of heroes. And we're still going strong. We hang out at the Academy of Interactive Entertainment, and we meet once a month. We meet online 4 times a month, or like every Thursday. And I'm a big believer in this idea that people should get in the same room together and learn as a community. And I also teach at Lake Washington Institute of Technology. Here's a picture of me taking my students to the Fry Art Museum where we draw. And probably the coolest thing I've done is work for Pokemon. I've done work for them in Blender for the Pokemon World Championships in 2022 and 2023. I also wrote a book called Blender by Example. You can go buy it. It's really cool. The new version is in the works. And I'm all over the internet. You can find me at Ogdog, and except I've kind of, gone away from being on the internet so much. I'm trying to unplug, and that kind of ties into my talk. I want to talk about getting back to real-world techniques, traditional techniques, the history of art, and how can we become better 3D artists by recognizing some of that history. So I also have 2 kids, and they're starting to learn Blender. Oh, look at them. This is a sculpt by my son Felix. There he is. Trapped with Susan. And I think an important part of what I bring to my 3D stuff is I just make art a lot. I love drawing, I love painting. These are some examples from my concept art class. And I draw, and I draw, and I draw, and I draw. And I've explained in the past that I don't think of this as so much a good habit as a nervous tick these days. It's a nervous tick that I just always have to be drawing. And I love drawing, I love painting. It just keeps going. And this is a lot of stuff, right? And that's just like a fraction of what I've done. So really quick about my talk. The short version of this is I disagree with how people are sculpting. I think a lot of times we have this gigantic sculpting object, and it's got cool textures on it, but we're micromanaging those polygons way too much. And I think we need to spend way more time in the block-in phase with lots of little objects that are intersecting without becoming one single mass. And if we want to sculpt with 1,000 little objects for each little chunk of geometry, whether that's your nostril, the tip of your nose, the bridge of your nose, how do we speed that up and have lots of little chunks as fast as possible? And to solve a lot of these things, I actually ended up diving into geometry nodes. Sorry, guys. So another quick intro on this talk. You can go and download the finished version of what this sort of rabbit hole turned into, which is the Boner geometry node setup. It's a cool thing that lets you make lots of bones, lots of muscles, and I'm just really excited about sculpting with this. I think it looks so cool, and it's just such a good way to start a sculpt. Even though this was just about how to do stuff in the block-in phase, this has turned into its own entirely different sculpting interface. So this is what I hate about sculpting. Here you see just a blob, and every once in a while I sculpt and I remesh, and I sculpt and I remesh. And a lot of this becomes managing these little seams of how 2 different chunks of anatomy go together. And whenever it becomes something that's wrong, you have to adjust something. And a lot of times when you're doing that, you injure the thing next door. So comparative to this, another really quick thing that I've worked on and sort of led me into these thought processes about how we should be sculpting. One of the things I did during the pandemic is everything was sad, and I wanted to help to put some good energy out into the world. So I started working with this data set from Tokyo, the University of Tokyo called Body Parts 3D. Z Anatomy also used it. And it's really cool. It's a gigantic anatomy atlas, but the meshes were a mess. And so a lot of what I was doing was cleaning it up, making it more functional. And I threw it on BloodSwap, and it got really popular. It downloaded a couple thousand times, I think. The start of this was actually me trying to make my own version of it, and I wanted some sort of skeleton, and I messed around with the idea of using skin weights, but geometry nodes was getting fancier and fancier, so eventually that's where this ended up. But I like this idea that I can sort of scale something and it's just automatically there, and you can control a chunk of anatomy with a single line to represent everything. So I started working on this more. I started trying to clean this up to make it more usable because the pose was wrong. It was like the arms were squished, and I tried to get it out to the side. And all the meshes had really messy geometry. So a lot of this was also remodeling things, remeshing things, cleaning up the topology, and making it something that was useful. And there's also stuff like the veins here, which I think it was a perfect example where the data of veins on something should really be a single line, and then the geometry comes second. And that's where geometry nodes is increasingly helpful. And so here's examples of remeshing it. And this file just took more and more time, but there's something really amazing about seeing these muscles right next to each other and how they connect. It's something where I wanted to see this more in sculpting work that I was doing. So this brings me to the concept of écorchés. Écorchés are an old school technique where in traditional sculpting, you build the model from the inside out. You start with a skeleton, and then you attach muscles to that skeleton. And because they end up being something that is based on where the geometry really is, rather than starting with a blob for your whole chest, you end up with form that looks really, really accurate because it's physically right there. So here's an example of an écorché by Ray Bustos, an anatomy guy who is really, really cool. I highly recommend his work. I started trying to think about this for some stuff I did. This was a little test file I did for Pokemon, just to show that I know what I was doing, because I need to update my portfolio. And this was like the first example of me starting this idea of using separate meshes for every single chunk of anatomy. And Blender at this time, this was around 2021, 2022, they had just added the ability to use Alt-Q and switch between objects. And I loved the way it looked when two objects are next to each other rather than trying to manually dig that seam in where two muscles would meet or two forms are bumping up against each other. So lots and lots of Alt-Q switching between these. So here's sort of the idea of why the traditional workflow in Blender for sculpting is wrong and why I prefer multi-object sculpting. When you have a high-density mesh, you have like a seam here. Like imagine it's like the crease of your nostril right here. And as you make that crease hard, you have to add more geometry. So then you pinch it, and then you inflate it, and then it's up against each other. But then if you move anything, you have to adjust the seam. And then what happens when you remesh it? Oh, suddenly you have to crease it and pinch it and inflate it again. And smooth it and pinch it and inflate it and crease it. And so it's this constant maintenance of these little seams that are just instant and perfect when you have multiple objects. And also, you're not screwing yourself with these gigantic polygons where you're constantly remeshing, trying to get the resolution that you need. In contrast, this is what it looks like when you have two convex forms making this little Visa MasterCard symbol. This is ironically a Venn diagram. Look, we have only about 20 polygon or 20 verts for each of these forms around, and that's it. It's really small. You put them next to each other, and it looks like this sharp, pointy moment in between them when you do this. And you don't have to do any of that maintenance stuff. The other thing that's cool is inflate and smooth. Because it's such a low poly mesh, it ends up being something where you can control a lot of the volume through that. So, yeah, I much prefer these multiple objects that are separated. Just an explanation for why this works so well. Muscles are a great example where the form of it is really, really quite simple. Muscles can only do one thing. All they can do is contract. And a muscle has only three components. It has the origin point, which is where it's connected to a bone. It has the muscle head, which is in between that and the last component, which is the insertion point, where it goes into an arm. And so all it can do is contract, which is the rubber band, which makes your arm go like this. And as a result, muscles are always really tight. The only time you ever have a muscle that's not tight is if it's wrapping around a form, like I don't know, maybe their back muscles or something. So with these little objects, you can have this tight rubber band line, and it always ends up being correct to muscles. But when you're using this high poly sculpt and you're doing these motions on it, when it's a single mesh, it doesn't work, because anytime you try and adjust one part, it makes this little weird gross bump on another part. I hate it. Oh, don't do it. So a couple of things I tried doing for this. One example was using grease pencil to make your sculpting stuff. This was a little dragon that I did where I drew some strokes in grease pencil, and I wrote a little Python script that converts it to curves, which converted it to meshes, and then you just separate it and you can start sculpting on all these separate. Part of the thing that's cool about this workflow is you end up with only these 4 brushes a lot of the time. To make little blobs, a lot of times it's just you mask something, you separate it, and then you start clearing the mask, you snake hook it, you inflate it, and smooth it. And very quickly you have a very low poly mesh where it's 2 muscles bulging against each other. And it's only a small amount of tools, and then Alt-Q to switch between them all the time. So this was a dragon that I did. This was actually made in response to somebody at the Seattle Blender user group, pondering how should you sculpt a dragon. And so I love sculpting dragons. So of course I had to, test my theories more, and I just started making a dragon out of little separate objects rather than one big object. And here you can see all the ways that I sculpt by just switching between them with Alt-Q. I'm putting a mask in here. I pull this little chunk out, and I'm going to use mask slice to new object, which is really good to right-click and throw into your quick menu, so you can hit Q and get it. Oh, I haven't done it yet. Mask slice to new object. And now I have these 2 objects. So then you clear the mask. I would love it if the mask automatically cleared, but that's fine. And you then just smooth it, inflate it, remesh it, inflate it, remesh it, smooth it. And very quickly you have 2 forms that are bumping up against each other. They're very low maintenance, and you just keep doing this over and over. Oh, yeah. So eventually you get to the point where you start doing the high poly sculpting. And at that point, you combine all these objects. And yes, you finally do remesh them into one super object, at which point you can start adding your scales and your details and stuff. But you can really see the difference in this dragon, which is all those muscles, those underlying forms, they really still appear like they're so clear, even though now I've added all these scales on top of it. And that resolution of like the muscles in the final product is something that I really like. So here's some things that I've run into like working on this. Number one, I oftentimes will, instead of using symmetrize and having X mirror on, a mirror modifier with a separate object means that you can push forms against each other. So especially something that's on the seam, like your pec muscles, having a single mesh that is symmetrized doesn't really work, because as you push them together, the brush hits the other side. So instead, having a single object where it has a mirror and you can sculpt on it means that you can naturally just get that convexity where 2 shapes hit each other like that. See that? Much nicer. Going back to ideas of, how do I like drawing? As a kid, I really loved How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way. It just taught you a lot about these, single gesture lines for a leg and a little bubble for your pelvis. And these were ideas where I want my sculpting workflow to feel like that in the block-in phase. I want to just go whoosh, and there's the dynamic neck swoop or something. So I started looking at how can I handle this. One tool for gesture drawing was to have these sculpting lines, and this was an early implementation of this. Some of the things that I think are kind of important here are I always want to have Alt-S to control the scale of my curves, and I always want to have Control-T to twist my curves. So I started working on ways that I can make this just in geometry nodes make a muscle where it comes out. And I thought, well, could I do bones too? And so, this is just a jumping off point where I start by making this, and eventually that just takes me to the next stage, which is when I turn it into a mesh object, and then I separate these by different objects, and then I combine them. So here's just an example of some of the curve stuff that I tend to like. this was a very early version of this, but at all times in a curve, I want to have some control over my twist and my scale. And I also philosophically think you should always UV unwrap your curves when you're working in geometry nodes, when you turn it from curve to mesh. So by having the draw tool in a curve edit mode and having it set to surface, you can start having this very Play-Doh-like feeling where you draw a little bit and it squashes onto the previous version. And every single time when I make a stroke, I can immediately follow that up with Control-T or Alt-S to fill it in. So maybe I throw one in here and I blob it much bigger. And eventually that becomes the basis for a chest or an alien face. Oh yeah. So while thinking through these problems, me and several people from Seattle went up to the Vancouver Blender user group, and we saw all our cool Blender friends from Vancouver. And it was at the Vancouver Public Library, and I got to chatting with Sharon Snow, who worked on Spider-Verse. Thank you, Sharon. And one of the things that she talked about is she wanted to have something kind of like the old app Paint 3D, where you just make a circle and it's a blob. And it felt like it was very much in this philosophy of drawing like, or making your sculpting feel like you're drawing. So I took that idea and I started working on an implementation, and I got this little blobbers set up. And it's kind of nice. It's very different from having a single stroke and it turns it in. Instead, it's a circle and it fills in. So the core idea behind this is you take any given curve, you set it to cyclic, you can blur the position so that it's smaller. You then make a mesh circle with the same amount of count around it, and you duplicate that for the same amount of splines on the object. Then what you can do is convert that back to a mesh, or convert them both to a mesh, make them copy position, and then convert it back to curves. You then fill the curves, and then you can start extruding them. And at the end, you got these nice little blobs. So another old idea of how traditional media worked for sculpting and how can I bring it in was the idea of bathtub sculpting. And this is something that sculptors did with marble a lot, where the idea was that as a bathtub was draining, the face would slowly emerge. And a lot of this meant that you would start with a marble block and you would cut out the silhouette of your Greek hero or whatever. Then you would finally fill it in. So I started thinking, like, how can I make this? There is the lasso trim and the polyline trim tool, and for a long time it was not very usable because it was just too slow. But in 4.2 beta, this is actually now really fast. So once again here, you can see basically what I'm doing to use this as a tool. I start by using the lasso trim to cut out of a just symbol cube. I then convert it to I select like the flat planes of it. I invert the selection so that I'm only selecting, so I delete all the other faces. I then select non-manifold stuff, so I have just the outer exterior. I turn that into a curve, and then I throw my boner geometry nodes on there, and suddenly I have little blobs. So it's one big blob to start. And then, again, this is oftentimes just something that I want as a jumping off point. So at that point, I can finally collapse this down into a completed mesh object, and I start using that lasso, or I start using mask slice to new object to turn it into several separate ones. Yeah, not bad. So again, I'm a grumpy old man now, and I think we should get off the internet. And one of the things I love doing to get off the internet is I sit on the couch and draw. And I was thinking about this sculpting stuff, and I wondered, I should be doing this with sculpting more. So while going through some of these projects, I started thinking I should use monster clay. So I got monster clay. Monster clay is an oil-based clay. It doesn't harden, or it doesn't dry out, and it doesn't get fired in a kiln. Instead, because it's oil-based, it's basically very pliable when it's warm, and when it gets cooled off, it turns to pretty rock-hard stuff. But you can always warm it up again. And so this seemed like something that 3D people would love. Here I'm doing some of that Écorché idea of like single muscles, and I think I sliced this in half and threw it on as pec muscles here. This was a Cyclops I was making while watching X-Men 97. You can use a wire mannequin, or you can use a wire, what's it called, armature to start off, and You can use tinfoil to fill in the inner part so that you take up less space. But it's basically the same thing as I was doing in geometry notes. I want little snakes that build up these muscles. So as a result, you see this like Sartorius on his leg, and it just starts feeling a little more realistic. And once again, we're 3D people. Why would we sculpt? Well, you can always 3D scan it. And this is just a real quick polycam scan of this guy. But it worked pretty good. So again, I want this to feel like an art tool, not something where I have to like manually mess with stuff. And so I thought about how would you want to draw a character's spine? Like oftentimes you start drawing with a gesture line, a line of action. And that's like one big swoop, and there's your representation of how a person's head and neck and spine is twisting in space. And so I felt like I should have a single line that turns into an entire spine. So I started making bone chains. And the more that I worked on this, the more I realized there's other things where this is something that I would use. So for instance, the fingers on your hand, I don't want to do every single finger bone. I want a single, soft, beautiful gesture that turns into the entire finger bone. Same thing for teeth. Teeth are oftentimes just this line that goes around, and then the teeth are there. So why not be able to do teeth? So there's two implementations of this. One that generates the geometry. The other references a collection. So if you have a collection of teeth or, spikes, you can manually generate them all at once. We should put spikes in this next. Another sculpting philosophy thing that I started running into is my problem with VDM brushes. Here we can see VDMs getting used. This is a nose VDM, and they're really cool and they're fun, and I like making them. But you run into these problems where you need resolution. So if you don't have enough resolution, you start having the brush break down. And there's lots of other problems with this too. After I did the stroke, I can't go back and change where that stroke ended up. So it's this nose that I draw in forever. I also can't separate by other, like the minor parts of the nose, like your nostril versus your philtrum versus the tip of your nose versus the bridge of your nose. So I wanted something that felt like a VDM texture, a vector displacement map, but with more control. And so I started making an implementation for that. So now what happens is when you draw a curve, this will reference a collection and throws it wherever it is. So it feels very much like you're using a VDM brush, but it's just a single collection. And the best part about this is you have those controls still. You can use Alt-S and scale it on just the X and Y axis. You can use Control-T to twist it. You have so much more power with this. And then when you're ready to use it, you can convert it to a mesh, separate these by individual objects, and it's ready to go. Now, I think another thing that maybe you might be wondering about is how does all this work with something like, face sets. Face sets, I think, are cool, but they are sort of implemented for single object stuff. So what I find is when I finally get done with this and I flatten this down into a mesh and I separate them, you can initiate face sets by loose parts, and every single one of these individual blobs will have a face set. When you merge those together into one object and remesh it, or if you remesh it, then it will turn each one of those into its own separate face set, and then you can work from there. Another one that I thought about was sheep muscles. I was trying to do a pec muscle, or maybe it's the trapezius on the back, and it just seemed like it was a waste of time to draw the same lines over and over going towards your sternum. So I wanted to be able to draw a single line and have it represent the entire muscle. And so I started making sheep muscles. This actually starts out with one of those curves, but it separates out the individual Y lines and then remeshes them into another thing. So I make a curve out of curves. And here you can see it's really nice. I can twist it, I can scale it, I can pop extras from the left and right. So once again, this is sort of like a really deep rabbit hole, and at this point, I'm really excited because it's like a different sculpting interface entirely. It's like I'm not even using the sculpt mode. I'm using this drawing-based, gesture-based setup to make meshes, and then when I'm ready, I flatten them down and I can sculpt on them. This is all available right now as a $5 pre-release on my Gumroad page if you want to buy it. Next update, I'm upping it to 20 bucks, so get it now. And yeah, I'm just going to keep working on this and adding more anatomy goo. What if I add something where you can add an eyeball with a single line? What about veins? And I just think this is a really fun way to work. It makes sculpting very fun and quick, and you feel like a kid again when you're doing this. So I hope you check it out, and I hope you enjoy it just as much as I do. Thanks, guys. So here we can see how this setup is functionally used in production and how it compares to a traditional sculpting workflow. A lot of this, I have this library of examples that I started from, and I like to just grab those and duplicate one off and start from there as a starting point for whenever I'm doing these things. A lot of that means the bones start off looking like bones, the spine starts off looking like spines, and then you can just tweak the parameters. And again, like a lot of this is actually not sculpting mode, it's edit mode, but it's all about getting to that finished point as quickly as possible. So using the spine example, or some of the chain bones, I can make things like the metacarpals a lot faster, and then just make a duplicate version of it with slightly different parameters to get finger bones pretty fast. And I think what's fun is that as you do this, the more you have like a library to work from. So if this is just a jumping off point, the goal is to be able to start a sculpt and be ready for the next stage of sculpting as fast as possible. Every time you do something with these, it's like adding to your library of presets. So a face is a face is a face. A foot is a foot is a foot. An ear is an ear is an ear. And they're different on different characters, but the general structures are usually the same kind of structures in the same place. So once you have a library of these, you can just go back to those. I'm occasionally checking a little bit of reference just to make sure that I'm staying a little bit anatomically correct. But a lot of this is very, very low maintenance and very free form. Just trusting my instincts of how does it look, trying to treat it like I'm an artist. And, it's almost like, this is like an entirely separate interface from sculpting or edit mode at this point. It just feels so much like its own unique process to me. And I think that's really kind of exciting. I feel like I'm making a kind of art that I've never seen made before. And to me, I just feel like it's really cool. A lot of anatomical structures like ribs are kind of similar to the neighboring ribs. So you can start from that as a starting standpoint. Curves still have some limitations as an interface. Control T to twist a curve, Alt S to scale a curve gets you really far. You can use fall off, a proportional edit fall off, so I can kind of move them around as a unit. But we might not have some of the things like pressure sensitivity, where as you push, the curve has thicker or thinner radii depending on your brush pen. Here you can see another example of a different preset that I'm using. I used the blob example just to create some sort of space that is inside of its ribcage, something that represents organs and organic goo that would help make some of these more freeform sculpting choices pop in really fast. So when I start drawing muscles, this just gives it something to jump onto when I use surface project. And so as a result, I don't have to worry about it jumping to the spine when I want it to go from like the rib bones to the hip bones. This is another example of what I love. I can, change these parameters around, and this is just like a very flat plane. And so it works very good for bony plates like you would have assembling a skull or sort of the jaw. And all of these are things, it's weird because sculpting wise, I think this was originally intended as something where I would use a workflow like this so that I would have lots of little blobs. I would then convert it to a mesh and separate them all. And I would then use those mesh chunks to eventually form the major sculpt, which I would then use as a jumping off point for face sets. But now it's like its own interface entirely. And it's really fun. So I just get to think in this Écorché mentality a lot more. Here I'm starting to finally get to the point where I just doodle my muscles in, because it has all these bones that it sticks to. And so all I have to do is eventually, I'm going to start. Let me see.
I will say that it helps to study anatomy. A lot of this stuff feels like it goes really quick because I spent a lot of time trying to have this stuff memorized, like the radius and the ulna, the general idea of your carpals and your metacarpals. What does a rib or what does a shoulder blade look like? And again, wherever there's a starting example of this that's a good baseline, I'll just clone that off and duplicate it and have unique settings for it. Here's an example of teeth. This is a chain example where several teeth can just populate along a curve, so I don't have to worry about each individual one. I might, when I'm done, convert it to a mesh and want to sculpt on each tooth individually. And that's an example of one where you would never necessarily want to join it to the main one. You'd want that as a separate object. But now I get to be a little nice and free and just sculpting in muscles wherever I think they kind of make sense. I can add extra divisions and scale the radius for something like the muscle head on that bicep. Your arm has all these muscles that go from like your elbow to your wrist so that you can twist all over the place. And it's so fun to use Alt S and scale them. You know, I think one of the things that I love about this is as its own interface, I can then also do things like afterwards, since the modifier is still there, the geometry nodes modifier, I can trim this and it'll look like the muscles are growing. I can modify the core radius and I can make it look like muscles are pulsing and bulging, you know? For me, it's just a really exciting way to work. At this point, I'm jumping over to my sheet muscle setup. And a lot of this is based on, getting this initial look. There is a flaw in the sheet muscle, which is it doesn't necessarily loop over every single stroke. So every single sheet muscle ends up being its own object because it's only going to reference the first spline. Hopefully in a future version I fix that, but I don't know how to do it right now. You could use the sheet muscle for rib cage bones too. But for the pecs, for the traps, for all these for your lats, these are things where it's like one muscle, but it covers so much surface area, and it's just not something where I want to use one curve to represent that. But I want to have that form because the form is going to come out in the final model. This is messing around more with the spine. Every once in a while, I pause these videos and while working on these, I would discover problems in real time and go fix them before moving on to the next one. But your neck and your back and your spine are basically just this giant suspension bridge with stuff to the left and stuff to the right. And being able to draw that stuff in, it's just really exciting when you can see that in a finished sculpt. Plus, I love having the materials right here so that it actually looks like meat and bones. This overall took about an hour and a half, 2 hours. I think you can see the timestamp on my Windows taskbar there. Although I was going back and forth, occasionally get out and doing a chore. So it's not an exact all in one sitting thing. But I think it took under 2 hours to get this guy set up. Getting in butt muscles. So much of human anatomy and stuff like this, it starts off with a muscle, and then a neighboring muscle, a lot of times, is very echoing of that form. So, for instance, you have your zygomatic process. And a lot of times I'll just clone that off, and that's the first chunk I use for my eyelid. And then I just clone that off to make my top eyelid. So cool. This is your this back muscle is really complex. It goes along your lower spine, but then up into your armpit. So it's a weird one to have a single curve represent that entire dynamic swoop. And every once in a while, I do things like it's good to just have a little blob that fills space so that you don't have to worry about it. These are more of those muscles that wrap around the chest. It just comes together so quickly. Again, this is available on Gumroad. I'll continue to update it, but again, I don't even think I'm sculpting at this point. This is like its own entirely separate thing. It's so cool. There's growing the muscles. You throw a little render on there. This is a much less complicated example that just relies on the blob example. And I just used this to bash out a really quick space. So a lot of this is you just draw and move around, and you can Alt-S to scale it. So it just gives you like this nice little immediate feedback. I jump back and forth between cursor and object, cursor and object a lot. Or cursor and surface. Surface is obviously good because form will be right on top of form. But if it's something that's like a starting form or something that's close to the line of symmetry, you can set it to cursor and not worry about that. Or you can draw it in profile and then move it to where you know it's going to be. So if you're relying on your previous knowledge, you can use that. A lot of what I end up doing here is whenever I want some different initial settings, I'll just duplicate something, separate it out, and then it has its own modifier that I can start making versions of this. A lot of these are little blobs that I'm putting together. It would eventually be that starting sculpt point. So when I'm done with this, I can clone it all off into a mesh, turn it into finished blobs, and separate by different objects. And then I go back to basically the sculpting workflow that I was showing, where I use Alt-Q to switch between objects. I remesh all the time with R and Shift-R to set the remesh grid. But as a way to get something functional, it's just a very nice quick way to do this. So at this point I deleted the mirror modifiers and separated them into individual mesh chunks. After separating them into individual objects, I mirror one of them and I copy the data. I want to make sure that it's cloning this empty, or mirroring from that empty. But then you can also use object mode and edit mode. So you just have more tools available for you in terms of positioning these. And I eventually get to this point where I'm really just relying on the limited forms of the human face. There's only so many muscles. There's only so many chunks of form that you need to worry about. And so by having them as separate objects, I just feel like it's a template that works really well. Around this point, I start going into a traditional sculpting workflow. Just remeshing and positioning these things as I need. And almost everything I do at this point is sculpting with inflate, relax, or inflate, smooth, and grab and snake it. That's it. Meshing. Any of these movements in a sculpt where you just have one object, it sucks so bad. I hate the idea that I can't just move my nostril back and forth without having it affect the lips. And so by having all these separated, I just have that control. Very quickly get into sort of a individual face. So again, I hope you guys check out Boner, and I hope you guys send me some examples of stuff that you make with it, because I just think it's a really fun workflow. It's very different from the one object to rule them all sculpting ideas. Bye.